If you want to write beautiful settings and activate your novel, then you need to read these 5 books immediately, because we talk about all the time how there is something missing in modern literature, that many of the classic novels behind me had this it factor that really makes them transformative and entertaining. And what is that it factor? Well, it is many different things, but for sure, one of them is the ability to write beautiful landscapes, make setting a character, and bring this mythopoetic and primordial voice to the page. And for various reasons, modern authors are missing that. Sure, the landscape of what we write about has changed. When you are writing novels about social issues in a city, or about technology, or the schizophrenic stream of consciousness works that have no plot, it's a little bit harder to inject beautiful settings into those works. But when I'm just reading a normal novel that's literary fiction that's been published in the last 5 years, setting most of the time just seems like something that authors just check off the list. Oh, did a little bit of world building, described what is happening, one beautiful line, time to move on. Did a little bit of mood building, we're all good. And the greatest authors in the past, a lot of the time, did not have this mentality. They didn't view setting as just a thing to do. And funny enough, I saw the author Aaron Gwynn say that he was in a workshop with George Saunders, who is one of the most best-selling literary fiction authors right now, and many people believe is one of our better modern authors. And he said that George said to them that he hated doing landscape writing, so he just found a way to avoid it in his short stories, which then when I think of it, it's almost never there. And so here on Write Conscious, I talk about the best books and authors of all time. I also help authors like you activate so that we can create a literary renaissance. And I really do believe, and if you've ever watched any of my past content or read my writing, that a return to nature, that settling down in the phenomenology of ontology, the beingness of being in nature and finding presence again in that reality, is one of the few ways we can make quantum leaps as modern authors. But I'll get into that as we go along. And so let's hop into our first work of the day, which of course you guys have already probably predicted is Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy, which is one of the greatest novels of all time, but is also a masterclass in excellence on how to write settings. And even if you don't want to write like Cormac McCarthy, or you are writing in a totally different literary lineage, what's great about reading his work and focusing on setting with not just him, but some of the other authors we're going to talk about, is that if your lineage and your style is generally lacking in setting, and you even just take or reach like 40% of the heights that McCarthy reached, which I think is doable for a lot of you guys out there, that will be more than enough to blow the minds of people over in your micro genre of book. And so I want you guys to keep that in mind, that we're not trying to write as good as McCarthy, and you can if you want, but what McCarthy really taught me, and why I'm putting him first on this list and why this section is really important, is McCarthy was a master of activating nature within his story. Because we always hear that cliche, like make setting a character, but no one actually does it. But McCarthy cracked the code on how to make nature just not something that you just passively describe, as I talked about earlier, to create mood and to give the reader a picture in their head, but he made it into a cipher, into a vehicle for him to talk about archetypes, the occult, theology, and other unconscious systems that he was presenting within the novel. And so I talk about theme all the time on this channel and writing transformative fiction, but I do not believe that you should be overtly sharing your themes. Like if you are writing about, I don't even know, whatever issue, the reader shouldn't necessarily know that you are writing about it. There should be some scenes and some disquisitions like Judge Holden in this novel that kind of showed the philosophy that you were trying to push, or at least explore with the characters. But beneath that, the rest of the novel should be unconsciously priming the reader to become more receptive of that. And one of the best ways to do that, is through setting. And so what's cool with McCarthy is that he looks at the philosophy that he is pushing or the themes he's generally talking about. And most of the time, whether it's an Outer Dark, Suttree, The Crossing, All the Pretty Horses, he creates a setting or locates the book in a location that would be a great vehicle to elevate those ideas. And in 1 minute, we're going to walk through passages from this book, and I'll show you on, literally what McCarthy's doing. But I want to bring up a point because McCarthy's the perfect vehicle to talk about this, because I want to talk to you. This isn't just tricks on the page. This isn't just about versifying and throwing in a couple paragraphs that sound cool, because being able to write settings actually first starts with the individual, where you are at in space and time right now, and if you are actually connected to nature or not. Because one of the missing elements that many kids growing up now don't have, that people like McCarthy had, is a ton of time growing up out in nature. I grew up in Las Vegas. And so 9 months of the year I was in school, and on the weekends I went hiking and did a lot of cool stuff, skiing and whatnot. But over the summer, I probably spent 2 weeks with my family up in Utah, but I was just stuck in my backyard and it was just 110 degrees every single day. And so I didn't really have this immersion in nature until later on in life when I kind of got it. But many people maybe live somewhere nicer, but a lot of people I know during the summer when they were out of school played video games, were messing around and were doing other things, and weren't like McCarthy. McCarthy, when he was growing up, would just wander around for 10 to 12 hours a day. At night, be walking around in fields, just exploring and tinkering around. And in general, that's a missing element that is so important, because when a kid is out there doing that, and we've all done that before, you're just out in nature and having fun, you don't have any ambition. Because I know people who, it comes time to, during their revisions to work on the setting, and they say, okay, well, I'm going to go to this spot, because a lot of people write about an area they are from or are currently in, and I'm just going to sit and kind of look at some landscape stuff and add it. But that's going into nature with ambition. And in general, when you try to take from something without giving it something, aka presence, you just get something superficial. And I've seen countless authors do that, and their writing feels flat a lot of the time, especially compared to better authors. And so what McCarthy had, not just in his youth, but in his adult life, he had a ton of time out in nature. There's an account of Cormac McCarthy, and this is funny, just a side note. After he left his second wife and came to Tucson, Arizona, where I'm at right now, he did get involved with Augusta Britt, who is that 16-year-old girl, and that's that entire story. But during the same year, he allegedly took that girl to Mexico. But then he took his second wife to Mexico, and she gave McCarthy researchers really good information when she said that they went down to Mexico and were studying and looking at spots that would be in Blood Meridian and All the Pretty Horses and other novels. And she said that they were down there for like 2 months or something, and he didn't write a thing the entire time. He was just observing and taking it in. He was there without ambition. And there are other accounts of him going down there, and he wasn't sitting there and writing, being the writer with the pen and doing stuff like that and writing poetry of what he was seeing or taking notes. He was just letting it kind of overwhelm him, and he was being present in it. And by developing that relationship, he could later tap into it. And if you want to tap into the most active book club in the world, the Right Conscious Book Club reads one Cormac McCarthy novel every single month. But we also read 5 to 7 other transformative novels a month and meet up every single weekend and talk about them. And as you can probably see, I am a huge nerd when it comes to Cormac McCarthy. And over on my Substack, where the book club is located, I also have a bunch of courses, literature courses, writing courses, but I have a Cormac McCarthy course that has over 30 hours of content. I have multiple Blood Meridian courses, a ton of content, unreleased interviews, draft pages of Cormac McCarthy that haven't been released, archived book clubs. The list goes on and on. Plus, I have a bunch of other content related to reading and writing, because my main focus isn't Cormac McCarthy anymore. And so if you want to get into Cormac McCarthy and read him with the group and have that accountability and start practicing, sharing your ideas, many of the novels I'm going to discuss in this video, just kind of by chance, we will be reading in 2025, I think. 3 or 4 of the 5 novels. And so if this video interests you and you want to dive deeper and talk about this, I'll be doing breakdown videos on all these novels when the book club time comes. And I'll be able to answer any questions you have. And so if you guys want to go deeper with all of these novels and obviously support me and the literary renaissance. Either a free subscription, because there's free content on Substack, or a paid subscription would mean the world to me. And so the link to my Substack is down below, and you can go check out my writing and a bunch of other cool stuff. By the way, Desert Orpheus coming out in 2025. Very excited for that book launch. But let's get back, because language and nature are basically at odds. Because I don't know if you guys know about animism, but animism is the idea that many pagan societies have, which states that inanimate objects also have souls or also matter, like a rock has a soul or all of this. But in Christian reality, and especially in Cartesian or objective reality, scientific reality, we don't believe that anymore. And one of the bigger killers of that, and it's really cool to look at history because we've seen this happen time and time again, is actually the alphabet. Because animism is not just about these things having souls, but also giving you an experience. And so the core of animism is anticipation. And so when you look at most pagan societies, their folklore, their myths, their songs, their fables, or whatever, a lot of it, their religions, it's all very nature-based. And it's not just because they are immersed in nature, but it was actually their vehicle of transformation. Because many of these peoples had this foundation in nature. And I tell my students this all the time. Back in the day, if you needed water, a lot of the time you'd have to go walk and get it. And on that walk, you didn't have a distraction. You didn't have an iPod. A lot of the time you were alone. And so what did you do? You daydreamed and you looked around and saw things. And you developed this relationship with nature and started to learn the names of the plants and started to learn what they looked like in different seasons and in different light. And so there was this kind of just this bland, I could say, or just kind of this mundane relationship with nature that everyone had that we no longer have. But then that was the foundation to anticipation, because some days or occasionally on your walk, you would see a cardinal or a jaguar or something crazy would happen, or a rock would fall in a certain way, or you would hear lightning strike, and it would create a satori awakening within you. It would create this this one could say artistic or personal development or mystical experience within that would elevate you. And we've all had this happen before, right? We've gone out and seen a beautiful sunset or seen something really beautiful in nature, and it did something to us internally. Well, that was the case in the past too, but that was actually, without art and without language, one of the main mediums, whether it was auditory by hearing a bird singing or a lightning strike or water running, or something visual like seeing something beautiful or seeing something ugly or dead, that people would kind of move through the archetypes and modicums of reality. But language replaced that. The alphabet was the greatest killer of that experience, because if I sit right now and I read Remains of the Day by Kashiwa Ishiguro, as I'm reading it, when I read, I am visualizing, right? We all see these pictures. We're visualizing what's happening, which is crazy. But then I'm also hearing voices. When I hear Judge Holden in Blood Meridian speak, I don't hear Ian Cadennach's voice. I don't hear Pee Wee Herman's voice. I hear this deep blah, but I'm literally having visual and auditory hallucinations as I'm reading. And it's more powerful at some level. It's not more powerful, but it's more easy to access it than it is in nature, because I can just sit right here and get it. I can literally do it instantly. And with a million different things, my experience taking a walk out in nature is the same thing every single day, but I could read about Africa and all these different places. And so the alphabet was one of the bigger killers of animism and this experience of anticipation and what's around the riverbed, all of that, right? Literally, that's crazy. That Pocahontas song, what's, around the riverbed, that's literally talking about this. But once that, we got divorced from that anticipation was no longer there. And that anticipation actually connects to the actual artistic process. So what real art is a lot of the time, like when I talk about art, not just like intellectualizing things and pushing ideas onto a page, is the jump, and I call it a leap, between the conscious and the unconscious. So during that leap, you create metaphors and ideas that shouldn't work, but do work for whatever reason. Like, we've all done it before. We've all seen it before. We see this crazy metaphor. And if you actually sat and thought about it, you'd be like, wow, this is actually really crazy that this shouldn't work, but this just feels right. And that's what art is at some level, being able to make these big reaches and synthesize it back to reality for the reader. And we love that, because what does it do? It's anticipation. We want more. It's crazy. It creates a random combo of images, or this random auditory experience that we could never expect. And we eat it up. And so, it's like I said, this is one of these hidden reasons why writers aren't as good anymore, because spending time out in nature without ambition is a training in anticipation, metaphor, and the leaps between the conscious and the unconscious. Because when you don't know what you're going to find, you don't know what you're going to experience. Things seem to be going well, and boom, there's the dead squirrel on the ground being eaten by maggots, and you're thrown into the horror and the temporality of life. And so as adults, we need to, be able to tap into this again. If you want to actually be able to do this, you need to, and this is not just good for writing, this is good for mental health, this is good to do with your children, your spouse, this is good just for everything. I used to live outside Las Vegas, I used to live in Las Vegas, and I used to go outside the city to the most beautiful area that you could get to on the outskirts of Las Vegas. I won't even say it because I don't want more people going there. The most beautiful part. And it would be funny because there'd be 2.5 million people in this little bubble, the city, doing every single thing. But I'd be there on a beautiful night outside during sunset, and I would see nobody. And I would say most people in Las Vegas, if you ask like, hey, what's the best spot to be that you can get to pretty fast, that would be on most people's list. And not many people would ever be there. And it just was really interesting that it isn't really it wasn't a big priority for people, even though it's one of the best things that you can do, like I said, for various different reasons. And so lean into this. I'm not saying you need to spend 8 hours a day, but a couple times a week. You're most likely 10 minutes away. And if you live in a crazy city, there's probably a park. You're probably 10 to 15 minutes away from an area where you could be secluded and have this experience with non-ambitious anticipation. And that is the foundation of all great nature writing. We'll talk about the other two components in a second, because this is what every single one of these authors we're going to talk about, and all these novels have this in them. And so what's funny about this novel, and like Blood Meridian, it's kind of a novel where people are on the road going places, and many novels have that, is that's what is cool. These writers are doing something, and then there's the Comanche scene. Crazy stuff. Talk about anticipation. And that's why that description in Blood Meridian is one of the greatest ever. If you guys don't know, in Blood Meridian, there's this random Indian attack that happens, and McCarthy has these crazy descriptions, but the novel kind of lulls you into it. You're kind of moving through the novel, and there's some crazy things that happen, but then boom, on page like 60 something, it just explodes. And then the rest of the novel kind of follows through with that energy. Makes it grimy, talks about reincarnation, astrology, numerology, the tarot, Gnosticism, all these things through the setting, time after time. And then when Judge Holden sits and does his sermons, he feels like the crazy guy. Even though McCarthy's been writing even crazier things if you know how to decode it the entire time. It's so wild. And so the best way to learn to write like McCarthy and to learn settings, once you kind of have that foundation out in nature and you're starting to experiment with your own thing, is just to imitate. Like, try to rewrite what he just said in your own words, or kind of apply to your style or your own story. And do that like 100 times with whatever author you want to do. Whether it's in dialogue or a certain type of sentence structure, whatever it is in writing, imitation is one of the best ways to kind of feel what it feels like to write something like that and embed it in your head. So then when it comes time to do it in your own work, it's not just there for you to use consciously. You most likely, hopefully, can unconsciously do it, because that's what talent is. That's what real writing is. That's what you can do after 10,000 hours. You can be writing, and some of these tricks, some of these kind of nuances or styles that you've practiced just come out without having to tinker with anything. And it's a lie that you'll just find that all on your own. Almost every single great writer was an imitator, was a stealer, and stood on the shoulders of others. And so there are a ton of other tricks that McCarthy does in Blood Meridian. And once again, if you guys want to go check those out, go look at my Blood Meridian for Writers course and all my other content on Blood Meridian over on the Substack. And so book number 2, we have to hop into it. So next we have to talk about Dune. The entire series, 1 through 6, are a masterclass in setting. Frank Herbert doesn't have the prose stylistic ability that McCarthy has, I'll be honest. But his scope and what he does with Arrakis and how he brings it into the story and the layering that he does with it is absolutely insane. If I remember correctly, the book is dedicated to ecologists, which is crazy. And if you look at like Herbert and his process, a lot of his research before this book was even written was on desert environments and all this ecological stuff. And if you really want to get a lot of the kind of philosophy of Arrakis and all that, like I said, you really need to read all 6 books. Don't listen to anybody else who says that number 2 sucks or any of that. Read them all. And it's kind of funny because I used to do some Dune content on this channel, especially at the start. I first read all these like when I first got out of high school and was really into them. And what's cool about the series is that you can read the books from a different, like looking for something different every single time, and it's just a well. For instance, you could look at these novels from a philosophical, a psychological, a political science, ecological, an interpersonal, a post-colonial, like all these different types of viewpoints you can look at this novel through. Semiotics, I've seen some good stuff on that, and it's just insane. So in Dune, the setting influences the entire culture of the peoples in the book. So we obviously have the Fremen, whose entire culture and customs are based on having to live in this desert and deal with all this insanity. But then the desert also, and the desert's power also attracts the colonizer, the extractor. And that's a potent thing you can do with setting that many great authors have done. I know John Steinbeck, Ken Kesey, and sometimes a great notion with the Oregon lumber industry, Frank Herbert in Dune. When you have this hardcore environment, it creates a certain type of people, but it also opens the door to exploitation. And what's so awesome about this book is that it's the desert. And we think the desert in the United States, for instance, is just this bleak place and nobody cares about it. But it's very similar to Dune in the sense that we exploit it not just with mines, but military bases, testing sites, nuclear testing sites, Yucca Mountain in Nevada, where they wanted to store all the nuclear waste, and countless other things. They're not going to be putting the Air Force testing site right outside Olympic National Park. But what's interesting about this is that this is all on a grand scale, and we're dealing with these cultures and these customs, and it's over, 6 books, and we can really kind of get into it. But with your novel, with your writing, people from different places are different. The area you live in actually changes you. And unless you are writing a city novel where the characters are in this urban area, the environment is going to influence not just what the characters do in the novel, but the customs that they did growing up. All of us, hopefully, when we were in our youth and growing up with our friends, did a bunch of crazy stuff. I know in the desert, because we didn't have any water, we blew things up. We did psychedelics and went to the moon. We did all these crazy things because that's what we were permitted to do. But sometimes I would go hang out with my friends in Oregon and they would blow things up and do that. We would go cliff jumping, swimming, kayaking, do all these other things. There'd be different activities. And those activities lead to people being different as they grow up and having a different perception, not just toward nature and the outdoors, but of themselves. The ocean culture in California is much different than the ocean culture in Florida. Even if you take the same subgroup, hippie surfers in California, are different than the hippie surfers in Florida. And you could just take all these groups and what makes it different. And that's something that you should be thinking about, especially, and something that you should really be thinking about if you don't know the area. Many of the greatest novels and settings of all time were written by people who understood how the culture, how these settings influenced the characters in the novel. I've been talking about Inherent Vice a lot on this channel by Thomas Pynchon, but he has all these scenes with surfers and all of this that's entirely accurate. That's a perfect representation of surf culture that he couldn't have just thought up in his head or seen on a movie or something like that. He was there and experienced it. And so going deeper, as you can kind of see as a theme here, Herbert in Dune engages in mythopoesis. He uses the setting as this kind of engine, this fuel for all this crazy prophetic and religious activity that is going on throughout all of the books. And once again, what's great about Herbert is that if you can write a good setting and set all this up, you eventually can just subvert it later on. I'm thinking of book number 5 right now. I'll speak in code here with the vault that's uncovered. I'm thinking of the end of 3 and the entirety of book number 4 in the Dune series. This entire aspect of prophecy and religion being fueled by the setting in what initially is this magical thing that we saw in the first book with Paul Atreides is eventually all subverted and flipped on its head. This book is also good because we get all the typical trials. The desert has this history of in literature and art, and just in, in light, and just in history of isolation, people having to cross deserts and be in the desert alone or with groups, and it's hard and people die. That's like a really common trope. But you'd be surprised across an entire novel that takes place in a setting how many of the authors don't do it. I had sometimes we do writing contests here on this channel, and I did one called the Desert Isolation Short Story Contest because I really wanted to push this idea. I was like, in many of the greatest desert stories of all time, there are these grand scenes of isolation that really anchor the story. So let's practice that, because one day in the future, this may come up in your writing. And so think about that stuff. Don't leave that out. There's a reason that these kind of reoccurring stories and ideas have been going on for a long time in certain areas. And the more you incorporate that, the better. You don't have to do it in the same way, and that's what makes you different. But if you try to divert from it completely, then you're just walking alone without the setting, which once again is just, I think, very problematic. And so if you want to see how to use setting on a grand scale in ways that aren't that complicated, kind of the deep levels of the spiritual ecology of this book are complicated, but just what the audience, whether they're watching the movie or reading the book, kind of react to is something that almost all of us can mimic. That isn't some expert Cormac McCarthy layering extravaganza. And so I feel like this is a baseline everyone should be at least striving for over the next 5 or 10 years, if not way sooner. So next on our list, we have The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. And you guys already know that I had to include some German prose in this list because the Germans throughout time immemorial have been immersed in nature writing, whether it's in philosophy with people like Schelling and his nature philosophy books, or the German romantic poets like Novalis and Hölderlin and even Goethe and their resurrection of nature poetry from the ashes, or, modernists like Mann, Hermann Hesse, Rilke, even modern German authors are really good at writing nature. And so if you have not read The Magic Mountain yet, you should. And in a second, we'll dive deep into a passage from The Magic Mountain. So this novel is about an engineer named Hans who goes to visit his cousin who has tuberculosis, at this sanatorium. And he only plans to stay for a couple weeks, but he ends up staying for 7 years. And the Alps are obviously a great place to set a novel. But in this novel, the setting isn't just a fun thing that Mann describes. It's basically the engine of the novel. And what's really cool about this novel is that he plans to only stay for a little bit, but that shift of deciding to stay for years is very well disguised by Mann, because the mountain, the routine, the air, how it rewires how you feel. I mean, we've all been there before. I mean, if any of you guys have ever been up in, high alpine areas and been away from technology and spent a couple days there, or just, went out on a hike. Imagine, being able to just do that forever. Your conception of the world and where you came from, especially if you're in your early 20s or something like that, would radically change, and you'd be released from so much. And it wouldn't feel like you were doing some dramatic letting go. Because if you went and lived in the woods, it would. But if you were around people and people you could fall in love with, and there was a routine and food and all these things, that would replace a lot of the anxieties of having to kind of be a survivalist or live off the land and stuff like that. And so beyond this, the mountain, the seasons, all of these things force, as I was talking about earlier, the characters to act in a certain way, because if it's snowing outside or if it's the summer, there's a different schedule. But then also the sanatorium itself has a strict schedule. And so this is such a great setting novel because we get this mixture between the sublime and everything that's happening in nature and even within, but then it's mirrored with the clinical, which is the exact opposite of that. And as you heard me talk about earlier, contrast is really important. And so McCarthy plays with these more primordial forces and these ancient codes of law engraved into the desert and all of this, and contrast that with the failed messianic vision of the kid and the devilishness of the gang and all that. But in this novel, Mann slows everything down, because in a second for a preview, we're about to talk about Moby Dick. But in Moby Dick and Blood Meridian and even Dune, there's always something going on, whether the men are writing and killing people, or there's some political machination going on by the Bene Gesserit or whatever. Things are in flux. But in this novel, man creates a setting in the sanatorium where you can just sit and the story can stay still. This novel transcends many of the ideas of plot and characterization that we're told that we need to follow. And what replaces that behind the scenes is actually setting, because the setting of not just the weather, but what's happening in the routines in the sanatorium are always unconsciously driving in your mind. And so sometimes the story can stay still and literally nothing happens for dozens of pages, but you won't feel like that. You'll be interested in what's going on because you're interested and invested not in the characters, but in the atmosphere itself. And so when you look about how man kind of introduces everything, and then as I was talking about earlier, kind of the slip into the sublime, as a reader, you go on that same journey. And when you look at most novels, there are transition scenes, there are moments of waiting that sometimes last dozens, if not 50 or whatever pages. I can't get out of my head right now the dumb Order of the Phoenix stuff in Harry Potter, not to turn this into a YA fantasy channel, but just, sitting around in the house doing these things. That stuff comes up all of the time. And so, in my opinion, I think that you can learn a lot from man for when your novel slows down. Because good novels are kind of like a roller coaster. There are ups and there are downs. And it doesn't look like some plot diagram, but it has its own organic flow to it. And so if you know that there's something coming up and it's this pivotal thing, or there needs to be this rest period, kind of following this model that man lays out of kind of this ascension, this rest period, then the eventual descension, is really smart, because I won't spoil anything here, but at the end of the novel, there is a descension and it's horrifying. And if he never took the character Hans up to the sanatorium, then that wouldn't be possible. And so the same could be said about what you're trying to do. By making the characters go still, by slowing down the plot, you could either add emotional complexity to the characters, so then when they go reconfront the world, things are different, or you can have the character basically stay the same or even release a little bit, and then while they're in this transition period, the world outside changes. And so then when it clashes again, things seem crazier. And you see people do this all the time. I mean, novelists, in just even shorter bursts. Some guy goes to a party and has a good time, and you're like, why are we at this party? And then the next day, someone's shaking him awake and there's a crazy event. Well, there was this kind of movement away from anything important in the story into the sublime, into this kind of restful state, and then boom, we're shaken awake. Or there are jumps in time and then something new happens. And so it's just something to think about this break. And one of the best ways to reinforce that and make people interested is through the setting. Have the setting drive how the characters act and how they feel. And so then you have to do less characterization and less plot-oriented stuff. It's kind of an interesting technique, but I just kind of wanted to talk about it because I feel like it is definitely underrated in that regard. And I could point out some nice passages, but it doesn't have the postcard Melvillian, McCarthyian style and some of the other books we're going to talk about in terms of prose on the page, but it's still there. I pulled all these quotes up, but I want you to go read it for yourself. How about that? Because it's not in the descriptions of the snow or the Alps. It's the entire thing. It's the atmosphere. And so that's what to look out for when you read this and when you study this for this purpose. And this is how, just a quick aside, how real writers read. You read for fun, but you're looking for things that can take you to the next level. You're looking for things that you can add to your toolbox because, like I said, I don't know, but if you are going to write for another 50 years, hopefully 60 years, depending on your age, 30 years, whatever, and you're consistent with it, and that's most likely multiple novels, there is going to come a point where you have some characters on the road, and it would be great to have some Blood Meridian type writing. It would be great in one of your novels to have this deeper, complex, ecological thing going on like in Dune. And there will be a point where there's this big transition, and having this in your toolbox will be helpful because that's what you'll be striving for. You won't just be saying, oh, this is what I'm doing. This is my story. I'm better than all these people. You'll know what the standard is, and you don't have to meet it, but you at least know what it is. And so moving on to our next novel, speaking of standards, speaking of maybe the greatest novel of all time. So we're doing it, everybody. We got Herman Melville, Moby Dick. We're going to be reading this in the Right Conscious Book Club coming up, I think, in November. I'm still a little bit unsure. I don't think December. I think we're going to be meeting up for this novel in the first or second week of November before all the craziness of the holidays start. And so if you want to read this with me, I'll be making a bunch of content over on the Substack about Moby Dick. Then please consider joining. We're also going to be reading Ceremony by Leslie Marmon Silko, which I'll be discussing in one moment. And so that's just another quick aside. And so in Moby Dick, the ocean is not just some backdrop. It literally is the medium. And Melville mastered this. McCarthy is just a derivative of Melville, as many before him were, just like Hemingway, in a sense, was a derivative of Melville. And so much more than the Magic Mountain, the setting in Moby Dick plays a huge factor. And like, obviously, any novel that takes place on the sea is going to have a lot of weather stuff and setting stuff involved. But think about it like this. Once the ship leaves Nantucket, land-based time doesn't exist. The Gregorian calendar, the seasonal markers, all of that is gone. Because think about it, when we're out walking around on the land, it's fall, it's summer, and obviously the tides change depending on the season. But I had a professor describe the setting of this novel as hydrotemporality, meaning that when you're on the ocean, things can change really fast. It could just be a nice day, then suddenly there's a storm on the horizon and a bunch of action is happening. It's the same in this story. In Moby Dick, you may have pages of the inventory of the whaling ship, or pages of just useless chitter chatter or philosophical diatribes. Then something is happening. Then something big is happening, whether it's a dramatic thing between people on the ship or obviously the whaling aspects, storms, or whatever. And speaking of random, whale hunting is based on sightings and looking and seeing this whale. And I absolutely love that these men, go on this journey. Ahab has this mania. He has this singular focus, and he's orienting himself toward Moby Dick, the white whale. But as they continue to kind of descend, Ahab feels like it being calm outside is a mockery, that nothing is happening. Then he feels like activated during the storms. And so this novel connects to that deep mystery of the sea. And Melville says, one knows not what sweet mystery about this sea, whose gently awful stirring seems to speak of some hidden soul beneath. And there is so much spirituality in this novel related to the ocean and whales, the weaver god. And Herman Melville, much like Cormac McCarthy, had Gnostic sentiments. And if you go check out chapter 47 of Moby Dick, which I would recommend this scene, it's actually really kind of axiomatic to so many different aspects of Western thought and literature. And Ishmael is on the deck of the boat and he's weaving like a mat or something. And so Ishmael, as he's kind of weaving with this thing called a weft, or a shuttle, he's moving it back and forth, and he's saying that this stands for our free will, that it kind of moves back and forth. These are the choices that we make. But at the same time, the ship is rolling with the waves. It's something that he can't control. And these stand for like the forces outside of our control, fate, nature, chance, God, whatever. And so the metaphor is that our choices are just, a thread, but the bigger pattern is woven by this kind of weaver god who is blind to what we are doing, blind to our threads, but is still shaping everything. And funny enough, this is actually, if you guys want some hot fire here, Melville didn't come up with this weaver god idea, even though most people think he did. This actually was first somewhat explored in the Odyssey with Penelope. And so the weaver god is all-seeing, impersonal, and blind, and is not the benevolent god of the Bible. And from a Gnostic lens, Ahab, and what I actually think Melville was trying to do, Ahab kind of embodies this Gnostic rebellion, pushing back against the sea that's kind of indifferent in its concern. And so the setting of the book, the ocean, which is kind of the turbid waters, to use a Gnostic term, the demiurgic realm, illusionary, cold, inhuman, sets up a story where we can confront these kind of spiritual and existential ideas. And what really helps drive this book home in terms of setting, as I was talking about earlier, is the encyclopedic knowledge that Melville had of the plants around. When you look at Dune, it's an encyclopedia of knowledge. When you look at Blood Meridian, I do something called the Blood Meridian tour over on the Substack. I think I've been to like 5 or 6 locations, and he is spot on with his descriptions. And I've been to other locations and haven't filmed down in Mexico, and they're perfect. And if you look, he uses so many different plant names and obscure things, and Moby Dick is that on steroids. I mean, there is a deep exploration of the taxonomies of whale species. He talks about the harpoons, the rigging of the ship, the layout of the ship. He's talking about currents, navigational techniques, how to kill a whale and bring it on. And so that's something that is also important with setting that I really wanted to bring up with this one. Like, this has the primordial tones and all this, but being hyper familiar with the setting, if you know how to do it, if you are writing something literary and you have drawn people in with a good story, sharing that encyclopedic knowledge, do really a lot to draw people in further because they believe you. They are of the world. We love learning about new things. That's why National Geographic and vlogs and all that's like so popular. Even history books. Like, we love learning as humans about new places and visualizing like what it's like. Like, I won't talk about this novel today, but A Man in Full by Tom Wolfe has some crazy descriptions that are pretty encyclopedic in a very Wolfian fashion of like what's happening in the story. And it makes me feel like I'm there. It makes me feel like, oh, okay, this is where this guy lives. This is what he's going to lose. Movies do the same thing. If there is a show or a movie series and something related to the land is a big deal or the setting, they just inundate you with landscape shots and folklore and all this stuff about what's going on. And the reason you do this, everyone, is because if you ground your story in realism, it's much easier to hop into the metaphysical. We've all read stories before that are stream of consciousness and you're just kind of thrown right into this magical world. But as I was talking about earlier, good use of setting and realistic settings can enable you to unconsciously layer within those settings. You can say lines, for instance, the sea had jeeringly kept his finite body up, but drowned the infinite of his soul. And so Melville right there reframed the idea of drowning into something not physical, but metaphysical. And so circling back to this idea of contrast, that's something also that all of these novels we're going to explore, or have explored, have. They have some realism in them, and they also have this romanticism. And it's a tried and true formula that has worked countless times. And so one of my favorite lines from the novel that really kind of shows this is this. Let's hop into it. By reason of these things, then, the whaling voyage was welcome. The great floodgates of the wonder world swung open, and in the wild conceits that swayed me to my purpose, two and two there floated into my innermost soul endless processions of the whale, and mid most of them all, one grand hooded phantom, like a snow hill in the air. So much like the Magic Mountain, and McCarthy does the same thing in Blood Meridian when they go down to Mexico, we have kind of these ideas and these passages that help move us into this liminal space. So the whaling voyage was welcome. And now the great floodgates, the controlled barrier, this barrier is now removed. And what is it showing us? We are now in this wonder world. And so down here we have unconscious symbolism. 2 and 2 is talking about Noah's Ark, and the paired creatures that, came together out on the, that were joined together. Which once again isn't just a reference to what is Noah's Ark talking about. It's talking about survival, destruction, inevitability, the ocean, God, order. And I like this use of verbal adjective right here with floated, because floated kind of talks about how these are out of his control, out in the ocean. A lot of this is going to be out of his control. And obviously this has a relation to water and the ocean. And I love this use down here of endless processions. You can see where McCarthy gets a lot of his stuff. This is basically talking about the whales being ceremonial, how they're going out in nature and nature is infinite. And so this is helping establish the whale as something symbolic. And so that continues down here with a beautiful foreshadowing of Moby Dick, the one grand hooded phantom, like a snow hill in the air. And this scene takes before Captain Ahab and the journey is even going. And so this is really good layering right here by Melville. This is the type of stuff you could read through this and maybe get that, maybe see an image, but you literally see that image. I'm seeing these whales. When I read that, I see, I'm seeing this dark black ocean with all these whales in it. And then this hooded phantom, and it's not even a whale, but I'm seeing on top of this ocean, this white thing, this white body of energy. Really good stuff. And I could pass through that and not think of that. Then when we hear about this white whale, who is this phantom that they're chasing, suddenly I'm more immersed in the journey. This is, like I said, this stuff like this happens hundreds of times. And so I can read through most novels that are not these behind me, but like new novels or even a short story someone wants me to read. And I don't see one of these, I don't see any of this going on. And I'm like, what are you doing? Like I said, unless you were writing some stream of consciousness, crazy story that takes place in one room and you don't need setting and people aren't flashbacking or stuff like that, which is like very, very rare, you should have this in your toolbox. And so Moby Dick is most certainly something that everybody needs to read. And if you want to do it with me and hear a bunch of crazy content I'm going to be doing on it, I would love to have you. And let's move on to our final novel of the day. So let's talk about Ceremony by Leslie Marmon Silko, which is one of the best American novels of all time. If you have not read this yet, I implore you to go check this out. This is also at the top of the Native American fiction list. And so as you're seeing kind of as a theme, Silko doesn't treat the land as some static thing. She views the land as something with memory and will and a rejuvenating and healing power for characters. She also does a really good job at grounding this novel in place. I got, there are these special moments in life where I checked this book out from my library, UNLV library, looks like on December 7th, 2018, and working on a final paper end of the term. And somehow in the system, it just didn't register that I had checked it out, even though I did. And, then it came time and I was like, I should return this. And I didn't see it. And I was like, oh shit, I'm keeping this. But this entire book, Place and Vision, is all about ceremony and is a really beautiful secondary source that explores through maps and many other things what Silko did in this novel. So Ceremony is about a man, a World War II veteran who has post-traumatic stress disorder, even though it wasn't called that back then. And he gets thrown into a loony bin after his time serving in the Pacific Theater, where I think his brother or his cousin dies in front of him. And then he eventually returns home in New Mexico. And the story on a plot level is kind of talking about his problems reintegrating back into society, like many people after World War II had. But in this situation, throughout time, when natives in the Laguna Pueblo tradition, for instance, would go into war, they would have ceremonies for them to be able to reintegrate back into society after you've chopped dudes' heads off and do all this, all the pain, even being hurt, losing people you love. But because World War II is so traumatic with obviously the Pacific Theater, machine guns, bombs, all of that, the old ceremonies weren't working anymore, and Tayo couldn't recover. And so this novel is about him trying to search for a new, deeper ceremony. And there's actual plot points and characterization and a bunch of other stuff. But Silko writes in a very dreamy way. She actually wrote this when she was doing some program up in Seattle and wrote this up there. And I've heard her say before that she had this nostalgic kind of feeling wanting to be back there. And so most of her prose is actually very dreamy and deals with myth. And she does beautiful descriptions of the land by naming things and just through prose. She is a contemporary of Cormac McCarthy. And I love the story of, anyway, I won't tell the story about Cormac meeting Leslie Marmon Silko. I've told that before. But what's really cool about this novel is that this novel does something interesting with time and place. And so we have our Western conception of time, which isn't in exact alignment with the Laguna Pueblo's spatial time, their cyclical conception of time. And so Silko blends this together and actually makes the novel's geography, literally how the events take place, function like a ceremonial map. And so if you've ever seen like a ritual before, like a Pachacuti Mesa or like North, Central, or South American rituals where like they'll put a map down and do a grid of things for different points like north, south, east, west, and all of this. This map, when you actually track the characters and where they go, looks like that. It actually turns into a ceremony in and of itself, which is absolutely fire. And because all this stuff takes place in real locations, we can track this. And this is, once again, one of these unconscious systems of layering, because it doesn't matter if you believe it. If you think this is all devil work and all this stuff, cool. But I'll just say I know that there are certain slots in our brain and certain archetypal patterns that are there no matter what, especially with like epigenetics and how we've been kind of programmed through time. All of that is there. And even if you don't believe with your logical mind and say, no, you can still, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, and you can still be drawn into it. And so it's really cool because the main, where a lot of the main things happen in this are like nodes in this kind of network of the ceremony. And when you start to examine like where things take place in mountains, springs, snow, it all also takes on a double symbolic meaning that most people don't get when you're reading it. It's a process, but the novel is also a process of not just what Tayo is going through, not just what we are going through, which that it mirrors that also, but also the progress of the ceremony. There's rain, there's erosion, there's plant growth, there's missing things. That kind of symbolizes, if you've ever actually done a real ritual before, whether that was an ayahuasca ritual or, like I said, just any general pagan ritual. I mean, one could say certain Christian rituals mimic this too, but kind of longer, more immersive rituals, that's what usually happens. It's not just like ecstasy the entire time. And so I just love this novel because it's functioning on that level. It's a good narrative. When I first read this, I didn't know that that's what was happening. I just kind of read it for fun. And then I got back into it in this class, and I had this professor, and he was like, this is what's happening. I was like, what? And he's like, yeah, go check out this book. And I'm sure he tells that to other students now, and they don't have it. But I like that ambition. We see ambition all the time with plot, with characterization, with style. But I hope I've kind of shown you guys, and read these books and you'll see, check out the secondary sources. Every novel I just talked about has beautiful secondary sources talking about the landscape stuff. Go deeper and then use that to elevate your own writing. What I like about setting too is that it's an unfair advantage for a lot of people who may not be as talented in other areas. Like, for instance, if you don't like to study, like I tell people all the time, study sentence structure and do all that. And I'll admit that bores the shit out of me too. That I was more into that when I was when I was like drinking caffeine. I was on 500 milligrams of caffeine every day and loaded, and I had no job, no family, no anything. It was much easier to get into sentence structure back then. I still do it. I have a sentence structure course, but getting good and immersing myself in studying, that type of stuff, that's easy. That's something that you can do all of the time and get better at. And it's something that you should be thinking about. Your relationship, not just with yourself and your family, but also with the land. Like, even if you don't believe in anything, like energetically with the land, like do you actually explore it? So many people say, I want to go to Bali, I want to go to Japan, I want to go see this, but they haven't even been to the next valley or the next city and looked around. They haven't been to all the state parks, all the areas around where they're at, and not just go there and be like, wow, that was cool, and actually sit there and see what it's like, see what the light's like in March, then go back in April and see how it's changed, what it's like in the morning, what it's like at night. Develop there is an infinite relationship, no matter where you're at, with what you already have. Whether, James Wright in Martins Ferry, Ohio became one of the greatest poets ever, with just a simple town with a river running through it in the flatlands of Ohio. Like, it's not that hard. You can do it. And it's not just good for your writing, it's good for your soul. And so thank you guys for the support. Thank you guys for making it through this video. If you guys want to support me for free, leave a comment, leave a like, get out there and continue the literary renaissance. Obviously, if you guys want to support me, you can head over to Substack. I have free and paid content over there. I'm going to be releasing my book this year sometime soon. I've been grinding that out. Hopefully that's going to be a book on place and nature poetry. And so thank you guys for being here, and I will see you very soon in the next video.